Welcome back to the Imaginarium. I'm Erik Goodwyn, psychiatrist, fantasy author, Jungian scholar. So, dreaming. Dreaming responds to our current situation. So, what if you're a person who's in a combat situation and you've actually seen battle, you've actually killed the enemy? What kind of things does a person in that situation dream about? Well, in order to tackle that question, you have to ask yourself first, well, what are dreams doing? Like, what are they about? When we're dreaming, our minds are essentially trying to generate meaning from our current life situation. Inner conflicts and the chaos of everyday events are taken into memory, broken down into little pieces, and then reshuffled organically into a new symbolic narrative. It helps us to make better sense of who we are and what our life is really about. So that means that dreams, like other spontaneous thoughts, are very emotion focused. So when we're really stressed, our dreams tend to zero in on our most pressing emotional issues. Now, why do you think that is? Well, it's because our brains evolved to take emotions extremely seriously. And that's because the emotional centers of the brain, like midline subcortical structures such as the limbic system, the brainstem, they have endured for millions of years relatively unchanged compared to our more expanded frontal lobe structures that are involved in so-called higher thought, rational, logical thought processes. So in other words, whereas we're quite different from other animals in our complex executive functions, we're very similar to other animals, and especially mammals, in our emotional processing. Those emotional centers are what they call conserved in evolution. So they exist in very similar structure across many species. Now, there's a good reason for this. It's because our emotions are very survival oriented. The famous fight or flight response, for example, kicks in when our emotional centers are firing on all cylinders. But we specifically are very social animals. And you could argue that we're more social than mammals. Maybe close to that being whales, dolphins, wolves, and other primates. But that means that our survival instincts will kick in when we feel our social standing is threatened. Those two have become intertwined in human beings. And it's because being kicked out of our social group in the ancestral setting would have been lethal. So that means that our brains and Mother Nature have decided that if your social standing is in jeopardy, then you need to respond to that as if your life was in jeopardy, because it kind of would be in that setting. Now, when I was in the Air Force, I had the opportunity to work with soldiers who had been in combat, often very recently. And I, along with my colleagues, and at that time was Dr. Chris Wyatt and Dr. Mike Ignatowski. Hey guys, if you're watching. Now, what we noticed, though, is that soldiers in combat zones would very often have a dream in which they were fending off wild animals that were attacking their families. Now, this dream, I think, can be understood as an expression of our survival instincts in a literal and a figurative level. Not only are they protecting their family from predators, which you could say it's as if I'm doing that, but it also serves as a really good symbolic representation of what's going on within inside of their own psyche. In other words, their familial feelings personified as family members versus the animal fight or flight instincts that are personified as animals. And they're in conflict with one another in those individuals. Now, what about people who, those are dreams very common that you'll see in soldiers who were in combat but weren't necessarily doing a whole lot of the fighting. In soldiers who actually had confirmed kills, and therefore meaning they were in much more intense combat situations, the dreams could become much more ominous. In those folks, the dreamer would oftentimes wind up finding themselves doing battle, knives, guns, you name it, with enemies, insurgents, hostiles, whatever it is. They would be dressed as their enemy would often be dressed. And in the dream, they would actually kill those people, or even injure them, kill them, whatever, only to find to their horror that what they had done was actually killed a loved one whose face had been hidden by whatever. So a wife, a family member, whatever. So what's going on in this situation? Well, it has to do with what I've been talking about here and what other scholars talk about in terms of war trauma, and it's moral injury. So what is that? So moral injury involves the brutal fact that the military is not designed for sitting together and singing kumbaya with other people. The military's purpose is to be good at killing people and destroying things. And as humans, we have a very powerful pro-social instincts because working together is how we've survived since the dawn of Homo sapiens. And yet, there are times when we have to kill in order to survive. This situation can be emotionally very difficult for us, even the toughest among us. And as a military psychiatrist, I can tell you that I have worked with some of the toughest men and women in the world. And yet, even in those cases, the ability to kill does not always mean that one can kill without remorse, even if it's the enemy. And these kind of dreams indicate that even in the best of circumstances, where a soldier was required to kill, there was no alternative, we had to kill them or else others that we cared about would be killed, it can still weigh on our souls. Even if you have no qualms about killing the enemy, soldiers that did this would often worry about whether or not all this killing made them a monster. In session, I would hear soldiers saying they almost went into an altered state during combat. Like they would liken it to being a predator, or sometimes they would say it was like being a Terminator, meaning a heartless robot, a killing robot. In any case, I find these reactions oddly reassuring in a way, because it means that even in these extreme situations, and as challenging as it can be, it means that there is still an innate part of us that wants to retain some level of human compassion. These dreams express the fear that you might become a killer who hurts someone that they love. And it seems to be a direct result of the fact that they have had no other choice but to kill. Killing, therefore, itself seems to evoke this objection within the psyche. And interestingly, now, when you look at fantasy narratives, which I always try to connect these things to, because it's so pervasive in fantasy in particular, in fiction in general. Any sort of war movies that you see oftentimes will deal with this kind of thing. And fantasy narratives, which would include our most ancient myths, have dealt with this issue on one level or another. And they often deal with this dual nature of hatred in warfare. In some stories, the relationship between the power that hating someone can give us is juxtaposed to the danger involved that very same act can cause. In other words, think about the Star Wars movies, for example. Anakin Skywalker, he gains his power by being angry and hating the enemy and all this sort of thing, but then it also destroys him at the same time. And I think a more nuanced look at this, you have Lord of the Rings, where, say, you have Faramir, who says, I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Now, that's a really, really powerful statement. So even though Faramir is dealing with enemies that are completely awful and remorseless and just rampage without any sort of compunction, he does not give in to, well, I'm going to give them whatever they give us. See, as tempting as that is, and it is very tempting, he does not give in to that. He says, I'm going to keep my eye on the goal. I'm only concerned about defending those that I love, and that's it. I'm not getting anything else out of this. And as a soldier, Tolkien was himself likely someone who had killed in combat. So I bet he knew about this on a very deep level and an intuitive level. And he incorporated that into his story, and it's one of the things that gives it so much power. He knew how important it was to keep this mindset when you're embroiled in a deadly conflict, even against enemies as simplistic as the orcs. And the orcs, I think he creates them in the way that he does in that story so that he can give us a clear contrast of this is what I think is the way it should be done versus this is the way I don't think it should be done. Does that take away from the so-called realism? In a sense it does, but on the other hand, it also provides you with more clarity of the theme that he's developing and the lesson that he's trying to convey. I think rather than worry so much about that, what is a little bit more worrisome to me is how in, I think, lesser constructed or maybe more simplistic types of fantasies, warfare kind of degenerates into the simple good guys versus bad guys. Let's root for our team versus the other team kind of thing. And there's no recognition of these darker nuances. And that, I mean, it can be fun and entertaining as long as you don't take it too seriously. But it doesn't reach the depths that a narrative could in this instance. For example, take a look at indigenous peoples around the world and the way that that cultures around the world deal with the fact of warfare and killing. And this kind of thing has been around forever. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years. And many times when you look at the rituals here, you can see that they are working on ways of engaging and dealing with this moral injury business. They recognize the fact that when we kill others, it can cause harm to us on an emotional level. And so they often will have ritual solutions to this that involve very elaborate shows of respect for one's fallen enemies, maybe even asking for forgiveness, depending on what culture you're looking at. And I think it's important to point out that these kind of rituals may partly exist to promote peace and reconciliation between enemies. Yes, that's the obvious purpose. But another purpose is to restore the humanity of someone who has been asked to do something that we are strongly evolved not to do, which is kill others. Hate, I think, makes it easier to kill. And unfortunately, in wartime situations, hatred flares up easily and frequently. And this is, in all honesty, it's understandable. You're threatening someone's life. You're threatening the life of someone else. And again, rage is another one of our defensive instincts. And that has very deep evolutionary origins too. But hate is a poison remedy. It cuts the hand that wields it. I remember my mom told me once that she thought that hatred was worse than hell. Instead of telling people to go to hell, she said, I think it would be way worse to say go to hate. And that has always kind of stuck with me. So that's what I got for you today. Make sure you check out my new book, Kingdom of Forgotten Darkness. Link is in the description below. You can go check that out. And I will see you next time.